Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon, everybody. I am pleased to convene this hearing of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Human Rights, and International Operations. Today, we will be examining issues related to the new United Nations Human Rights Council, which held its first session from the 19th to the 30th of June, and two special sessions in July and August, respectively. Let me say at the outset that I believe that it is tragic and dismaying in the extreme to note that despite the self-congratulatory euphoria of last March at its creation, the new human rights machinery remains broken, in need of serious repair and fundamental reform. The Human Rights Council has thus far continued the credibility deficit of its predecessor. The victims of abuse throughout the world deserve better, and thus far they haven't gotten it. Not only did the Council unfairly and myopically, in my opinion, criticize Israel at its inaugural session, but both special sessions convened to date on July 5th through 6th and August 11th were held exclusively to condemn Israel with nary a mention of egregious abuse by Hezbollah or Hamas or the roles of Syria and Iran. Amazingly, there have been no special sessions on the ongoing and worsening situation, the genocide, in Darfur. No special session on the systematic use of torture by the People's Republic of China, or even though Manfred Nowak, the UN's own rapporteur on torture, last December issued a scathing report on the pervasive use of torture by the Chinese government. No special session on Cuba's abuse of political prisoners, or on Burma, or on North Korea, or Belarus, or Iran, or Zimbabwe, just Israel. Not only has the Council expended all of its efforts on Israel, but it has also failed to do so in a fair and equitable and equal manner. The Council has made no reference to the roles, as I indicated, of Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, or Iran in the creation of the situations concerned, or to the harm inflicted by parties other than Israel. Thus, the early evidence indicates that the Council has already been co-opted by an extremely biased and narrow agenda. This development is of extreme concern, both for the international human rights community and for those of us convinced of the need for reform at the United Nations. The United Nations, the Human Rights Council, and through it, the United Nations as a whole, have a vital role to play in the promotion and protection of human rights. It is critical that the United States and other human rights defenders do everything as quickly as possible to reverse the direction in which the Council is heading. By way of background, on April 19, 2005, this subcommittee held a hearing on the Council's predecessor, the UN Commission on Human Rights. In my statement at that hearing, I noted that the Commission had come under increasing criticism from numerous quarters. A UN high-level panel concluded in December of 2004 that the Commission's capacity to fulfill its mandate had been undermined by eroding credibility and professionalism. The panel pointed out that states with a poor human rights record cannot set the standard for human rights. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan later agreed with this assessment, and he told the Commission that, and I quote him, "Unless we remake our human rights machinery, we may be unable to renew public confidence in the United Nations itself." On March 15th of 2006, of this year, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution that replaced the discredited Commission with the Human Rights Council. The General Assembly gave the Council the mandate to promote, quote, "universal respect for the protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction of any kind and in a fair and equal manner," and to, quote, "address situations of violation of human rights, including gross and systematic violations." The United States, as we know, was one of 4 countries to vote against the resolution. The U.S.'s opposition was based on the absence of a stronger mechanism to maintain credible membership, and thus the lack of an assurance that the Council would be an improvement over its predecessor. In my public statements issued immediately after the resolution's adoption, I expressed my deep disappointment that the General Assembly had settled for a weak and deeply flawed replacement for the Commission. The flaws I noted included the membership concerns expressed by the U.S., as well as lack of protection for Israel from unfair and biased special sessions, which now we have seen are happening. Another potentially serious flaw that I have noted is the Council's mandate to promote follow-up to the goals and commitments related to the promotion and protection of human rights emanating from UN conferences and summits. My concern here is based in large part on the serious distinction that exists between human rights treaties and consensus documents resulting from UN conferences. Treaties are negotiated by UN member states, and they may or may not be subsequently ratified through the established approval process of each country. Those states that do ratify a treaty thereby agree to be bound by its provisions under international law. UN conference documents, on the other hand, are the result of policy debates and are agreed to by consensus at the end of a conference. These consensus documents are not negotiated as legally binding instruments and are not subjected to a ratification process. They do not have and should not have the same legal authority as treaties. For this reason, the UN General Assembly, I believe, was extremely misguided when it assigned the Human Rights Council the task of promoting these conference commitments. By doing so, it threatens to diminish the moral and legal persuasiveness of internationally recognized human rights by equating them with mere policy directives. Even more troubling, the resolution calls for the promotion of human rights emanating from UN conferences. The very word emanating implies that a characteristic or action need not be clearly defined in a conference document in order for the Council to undertake its promotion. This, together with the fact that these conference documents are consensus documents, raises the specter that any number of characteristics or actions may slide their way into the international human rights framework without the ratified agreement of countries who would then be pressured to abide by their provisions. Such a gaping loophole in the international legal process is antithetical to the democratic ideals of our own country and to the principles on which the United Nations is based. This potential for gross abuse of the United Nations human rights mechanisms is already being realized with respect to the issue of abortion. For several years now, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Human Rights Committee, and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights have been pressuring governments to legalize abortion even though no UN human rights treaty addresses the issue. These and other treaty bodies pursue this ideological agenda while ignoring the fact that abortion exploits women and is an act of violence against children in and of itself. Just 2 weeks ago, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women published concerns about the illegality of abortion in Chile and the Philippines. In October of 2005, the Human Rights Committee decided in the case from Peru, presented to it under the ICCPR optional protocol, that denying access to an abortion violates women's human rights. It made no reference to an unborn child's right to life and the life of that child to be free from the terrifying effect of an array of child-killing poisons currently on the market, or by dismemberment, the two most commonly methods of abortion. Even the Committee Against Torture, which is responsible for monitoring compliance with the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, is joining this assault on unborn children. In February of this year, pursuant to its review of Peru's compliance with the Convention, the committee concluded that Peru's omission and failing to provide abortion constitutes cruel and inhuman acts. The committee had no basis in the Convention for challenging the state party's refusal to provide an abortion. However, if one were to concede that the committee is warranted in examining the issue of abortion under Article 16, then the committee would have no choice but to conclude that chemical poisoning and dismemberment of the fragile, sensitive body of an unborn child is a cruel and inhumane act. And I'd also note parenthetically that we now know that unborn children feel pain from at least the 20th week onward, perhaps even earlier, which is why I've introduced into Congress the Unborn Child Pain Awareness Act, which is now pending in committee. In many other of their decisions, these treaty bodies do not refer to the text of the treaty that they are supposed to be monitoring, but to documents adopted at UN conferences. And again, they never take note of the statements of explanation or conditionality put on to their approval or their consensus by governments at the time of their adoption. They do so out of necessity, since the countries that they are pressuring have never agreed to legalize or provide for the destruction of the life of an unborn child in the instruments that they have ratified. Based on this entrenched and growing manipulation of the UN human rights mechanisms to promote abortion, I believe there is no reason to believe that the Human Rights Council will also, there is reason to believe, may be co-opted into promoting ideological agendas at variance with the established human rights norms of the international community. Finally, let me say that the skepticism generally about the Human Rights Council to promote human rights and address human rights violations, and to do so in a fair and equitable manner, has increased with the election of its members and, as I have indicated, subsequent activity. Although the General Assembly resolution states that its members must take into account the contribution of candidates to the promotion and protection of human rights, such notorious human rights abusers as China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia were elected to the Council. Since it began its work less than 3 months ago, the Human Rights Council has issued 3 country-specific resolutions, again, all of them targeting just one country. I therefore have convened this hearing to examine what needs to be done to prevent the Council from repeating or further regressing from the failures of the Commission on Human Rights, as well as to support any signs of improvement over its predecessor. The subcommittee is interested in exploring how the Council is being assisted by the United States and others to fulfill its mandate, the areas in which further assistance and reform is required, and the standards that the Human Rights Council will need to meet in order to qualify as a credible international human rights body. In his address in April 2005 to the Commission on Human Rights, the UN Secretary General argued for a new reformed Human Rights Council on the basis that it would, quote, allow for a more comprehensive and objective approach. And ultimately, he went on to say it would produce more effective assistance and protections, and that the yardstick by which, and that is the yardstick by which it would be measured. It is not too soon to start measuring the Council by this yardstick, and we look forward to hearing the testimony of our distinguished witnesses that will provide us with the means for such an evaluation. I'd like now to introduce our first panel, beginning with, just noticed that my good friend has joined us. Would you, David, do you have any opening comments? Chairman Morton.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank Congressman Smith for not only this hearing, but all of his activities that are aimed at alerting the American people to the reality of the United Nations and the challenges that we face internationally. There's so many people in the United States that, because of what I have to call an overwhelming public relations campaign on the part of the United Nations, have an inaccurate view as to just what the reality of the United Nations is all about. And Congressman Smith has done more to try to alert us to the realities of, to the limitations of that organization, because if we mistakenly place our faith in an organization that is a facade and that instead whose flaws weigh down its own capabilities of doing good, we will pay the price. And there already has been the price paid in Africa and elsewhere, where hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives because we have erroneously relied on the United Nations to do what was right. Whether the United Nations Human Rights Commission or whether they call it a council, we have to always be aware that a significant number of members of the United Nations, UN member states, are controlled by criminal cliques. They are not only non-democratic, many of these countries are authoritarian and run by criminals. And these people run roughshod over their own people, and they have learned also how to make sure that they are using their influence on organizations like the United Nations to protect their positions in their own country, rather than having the United Nations as a force for democratization and liberalization. And of course, nowhere is that more evident than the hypocrisy that's seen in what was the United Nations Commission for Human Rights, and now I guess they call it the United Nations Council on Human Rights. But words are irrelevant. What is relevant is whether or not we have a standard of truth and justice that is a standard that is not based on some sort of political accommodation with a totalitarian regime, which so often happens in the United Nations. So I'd like to thank Representative Smith for his leadership, and I'm glad to participate today and looking forward to the testimony. Thank you very much.
Chairman Robacker, thank you very much for your kind comments and for your extraordinary work in investigating whether it be the oil for food scandal or any of the other egregious mistakes that have been made. You have been a real leader. I'd like to yield to Dr. Bozeman.
Just very briefly, I just want to thank you for holding the hearing and look forward to the witnesses. Thank you.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Mr. Chairman, thank you as well for focusing our efforts today on the United Nations Human Rights Council. I appreciate your hard work that went into this hearing and the efforts to keep the issue of human rights central to the work of this subcommittee and to our consideration of United Nations reform. I also look forward to hearing from you, our distinguished witnesses, and commend you for working as well to keep our government cognizant of the duty we have to provide fundamental justice and uphold human dignity for the people subject to the Commission's authority, especially for the world's most vulnerable and marginalized persons. I believe that it is critical for the UN Human Rights Council to diligently and objectively uphold the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And while I fully understand the concerns which led the United States to vote against the resolution to replace the widely discredited Human Rights Commission with the Council, I am confident that we remain vigilant in our cooperation with Council members in an observer capacity to further our nation's longstanding commitment to an authentic and credible human rights agenda in the United Nations. It is also my understanding that the United States may consider running for the Council in 2007, and I'm eager to hear your testimony and the assessment of the various witnesses today as to whether, quote, reform or, quote, regression best describes the Council's activities to date and how you would envision the prospects for future U.S. participation in the Council. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fortenberry. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panel, beginning with Dr. Mark Lagon, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. In this capacity, he has broad responsibility for policy development and administration, especially within UN's human rights policy. Dr. Lagon previously served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, where he focused on UN and international organizations, democracy and human rights, and public diplomacy. And then we'll hear from Ms. Barks-Ruggles, Erica Barks-Ruggles, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. As a career member of the Foreign Service, she focuses on policy, programming, multilateral, and global affairs. Ms. Barks-Ruggles has also previously served with the policy planning staff, the political economic section of the U.S. Embassy in Oslo, Norway, and has been an International Affairs Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Lagon, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure to be here with you again to discuss the UN Human Rights Council, and thank you very much for holding this hearing. President Bush has proclaimed that at this critical time in the history of freedom, no nation can evade the demands of human dignity. In countries like Iran, North Korea, Belarus, Burma, Syria, Zimbabwe, and Cuba, governments must become accountable to their citizens and embrace democracy. Much work remains to be done if the new Council is to live up to its noble calling and actually advance these goals. I appreciate the opportunity to help present the administration's views on the Human Rights Council, and I look forward to hearing the views from the highly regarded witnesses in your second panel. I have to say, I consider Jennifer, Brett, and Hillel all valuable partners. My bureau, the Bureau of International Organization Affairs, is responsible for policy related to the institutional workings of multilateral organizations. My good friend and colleague, Erica Barks-Ruggles, as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, works to promote human rights in multilateral organizations, particularly in country-specific cases. The United Nations Charter specifically called for the creation of a commission for the promotion of human rights, establishing it as one of the founding priorities of the United Nations. With the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, the Commission on Human Rights was one of the first two functional commissions set up at the UN. In its early days, that commission successfully negotiated the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which for the first time defined international standards and understanding of human rights. In the intervening years, however, the clarity of purpose was lost as countries responsible for serious human rights abuses sought and obtained membership on the Commission on Human Rights in order to prevent criticism of their own records. In recent years, Sudan was elected and re-elected to the Commission. Libya was chosen as chair of the Commission on Human Rights, despite the United States calling a vote, breaking a precedent of the past of there never having been votes called. And the United States was defeated in a re-election bid for the first time. Mr. Chairman, you and I were out at the last full session of the Commission on Human Rights, and we were working together, and I would venture to say that neither of us was surprised by the state of the pathologies of the Commission, saddened that we weren't surprised anymore. In the face of those pathologies, Secretary General Annan called for a reform of the human rights machinery in his report last year, In Larger Freedom. That report stated the Commission on Human Rights created a credibility deficit, which casts a shadow on the reputation of the UN system as a whole, and he called on member states to replace it. The resolution creating the Council was crafted over a course of several months of negotiations in New York. The United States had two major touchstones that it was focused on. One was improving the body's membership through two essential means: requiring election of members by 2/3 of member states present and voting, and barring the membership of countries subject to Security Council sanctions related to human rights or the promotion of terrorism. We needed to make sure that the CHR's successor was populated by firefighters, not arsonists. Unfortunately, the negotiated text did not include these criteria. We ultimately called for a vote and voted no on the resolution March 15th of this year in the General Assembly. The Secretary General, as you have referred to, set the goal of creating a body that was definitively better than the Commission on Human Rights. We felt that a historic opportunity had been squandered for creating a definitively better body. In fact, with the acquiescence of some of our high-minded friends in the world who were willing to settle for good enough. The new 47-member council is a subsidiary organ now of the General Assembly rather than the 54-member Economic and Social Council. Its members are elected by the whole UN membership now rather than just 54 nations in the Economic and Social Council. So a benefit is that while a country could have been elected to the Commission with 26 votes or even fewer, depending upon how many showed up to the ECOSOC election, now the resolution creating the Human Rights Council does require 96 votes at a minimum for election to the Human Rights Council. In addition, all countries elected to the Council are voted on individually, not part of a regional slate as it occurred before. There is an important difference between the former Commission and the new Council related to its composition. When the body became a subsidiary of the UN General Assembly, it was decided to give the Council the same geographic distribution of seats as in the mother body, the General Assembly. This had the effect of increasing the number of African, Eastern European, and Asian members, regions with countries with mixed records on human rights. The percentage of countries from the Western European and other group and the Latin American and Caribbean group declined. This is significant because many of the African and Asian countries tend to favor economic, social, and cultural rights over political and civil rights. These regional groups have historically sought to eliminate country-specific resolutions, which the United States has considered crucial as a tool in human rights. The current composition of the Council has also given the Organization of the Islamic Conference greater influence, allowing it to focus disproportionately on the Israel-Palestinian conflict at the expense of other troubling situations around the globe. My colleague Erica Barks-Ruggles will address some of these implications of the composition of the Council in practice. I do want to note some positive developments. As we saw in the May election, most regions presented more candidates than open slots, providing options from which to choose. Some of the worst human rights abusers, such as Sudan and Zimbabwe, chose not to risk losing and didn't run. And some troublemakers ran and lost, notably Iran and Venezuela. Additionally, a provision in the resolution creating the Council allows for suspension of the membership of a state that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights with a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly of the Council, if the membership of the Council has the political will to pursue that. Procedurally, The Council will meet for no less than 10 weeks a year and no fewer than 3 sessions, so that there isn't one once-a-year predictable theatrical session as existed with the Commission on Human Rights. The Council also explicitly has the ability to convene special sessions when it's needed to address urgent situations. I delivered a formal intervention during the negotiations in New York to create the Council, calling for multiple prudent triggers for special sessions: a request of the majority of the members of the Human Rights Council, or a call by the Secretary General for a special session, or a call by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Unfortunately, other nations didn't follow our advice, and one trigger was created with a rather low bar, a third of the membership of the Council wanting to have a special session. This low bar has allowed some members of the Council to push through 2 special sessions focused on Israel. Although we lament the grossly unbalanced focus on Israel during the early days of the Council, we're going to strive to protect this mechanism of special sessions to deal with what it was designed to deal with, the most morally troubling situations on multiple continents. The Council is engaged in 2 important processes: developing a universal periodic review mechanism and reviewing all its mandates from the previous Commission. In open-ended consultations, which is UN speak for open to all nations, including observer states, to be full participants, there are negotiations of both these things. We believe the universal periodic review ought to be a peer review process in which states take responsibility, but fully open to NGOs and human rights experts to give information and shine a light on the record of countries. Second, we seek to ensure that nations are judged in this universal periodic review only on the basis of the treaties that they have ratified. You should think about that in terms of those the United States has ratified. Third, we would like to see the review of all UN member states recur within 5 years and be conducted between the sessions of the Council. We don't want to allow this universal periodic review to crowd out time spent on important technical assistance to transitioning governments or frank condemnations of heinous abusers. In the first year of the Council, it's also reviewing the so-called special procedures and rapporteurs inherited from the Commission on Human Rights. Our mission in Geneva is fighting to preserve those special rapporteurs that are devoted to individual countries and those important ones that are devoted to political and civil liberties, while seeking to diminish the number of thematic mandates related to economic, social, and cultural rights that are of questionable merit. In particular, those rapporteurs devoted to particular places like Belarus, Burma, Cuba, North Korea, and Sudan, they add to the scrutiny offered by the international community of the worst human rights abuses in the world, and they need to be sustained. I just want to say a word about an important tool, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is to be distinguished from the elected body of member states, the Human Rights Council. The Council will rely on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to do actual field work to protect and promote human rights around the world. We want to see enhancements of that Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or OHCHR, to have the capacity to deploy human rights monitors rapidly to crisis spots, to boost significantly the number of non-emergency staff in the field, to increase technical assistance and training in countries around the world, and to dispatch fact-finding missions. The OHCHR should focus its resources on strengthening its field offices, which offer tangible help, rather than building up a bureaucratized think tank in comfortable Geneva. The Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights rightly said that in the creation of the Commission, the era of norm setting, of developing new treaties and passing lofty rhetorical statements, should be succeeded by an era of implementing human rights on the ground. The United States welcomes this approach. We understand fully that you, as members of the committee, are concerned that the new Human Rights Council is not a real improvement over the Commission on Human Rights. We share these concerns. Many of the Council's collective decisions so far have been troubling. There's still opportunity to improve the Council's membership and to give it mechanisms that really promote human rights. And the United States will work hard with our partners in the days and weeks ahead to bring a truly improved body. Now I'm delighted to turn to my colleague to discuss how the Council has performed to date.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing. On the importance of a strong, credible, and capable Human Rights Council. Mr. Chairman, today I'm delivering brief remarks, but I ask that longer remarks be submitted for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. This hearing, along with your involvement and those of your committee members, Mr. Chairman, demonstrates that the U.S. Congress wants the UN Human Rights Council to function as a protector of human rights. Secretary Rice agrees with you. She's stated, quote, "The United States remains committed to supporting the United Nations' historic mission to promote and protect human rights of all the world's citizens," end quote, in her remarks when we decided not to run for the Human Rights Council as an explanation of that decision. I'm pleased to join my colleague Mark Lagon today. Our bureaus work very closely together on the coordination of UN human rights policy in multilateral organizations. As Mark has discussed, the United States had two major objectives for reform of the deeply discredited Commission on Human Rights. The first was to improve membership, the second to preserve its critical authorities, including its ability to address egregious violations of human rights. As he outlined, we worked hard to create a worthy Human Rights Council. And even though we were unable to vote positively on the creation of the Council, we believed then, and we still believe, that we need to work hard to make this Council the strong, capable, and credible body that we all want it to be. Our history and the value we all place on supporting human rights around the world demand it, and the United States is committed to working with its allies to do just that. As Mark outlined, the Human Rights Council's record so far has been mixed with regard to the improved membership. For example, the resolution creating the Council said that countries should take into account a candidate's human rights record when voting for its membership. The Council's first elections were indeed interesting in this respect, breaking with traditions of the former Commission. In these elections, for the first time in UN history, candidate countries made public pledges to enforce human rights obligations and standards at home. Most also agreed that their records should be measured not only by their treaty obligations, but by how they complied with their pledges. The U.S. did make a pledge, even though we chose not to run. This is a significant step, but we are watching closely to see how countries deliver. More importantly, we will see how countries that do not deliver on their pledges are judged by fellow members. Further, as Mark outlined, a number of members of the Commission on Human Rights opted not to run for the new Council. For example, some countries with very troubling human rights records, including Zimbabwe, Eritrea, and notably Sudan, decided not to seek re-election. They may have doubted that they could get re-elected individually to the new body instead of as part of a regional slate. They may also have preferred not to subject themselves early on to the scrutiny of the Universal Periodic Review, which Mark has outlined. In addition, members of geographic groups in the General Assembly exerted pressure on some of the member states to drop out of the race so that repressive regimes would not bring discredit to their region or to the Council. We hope that this sort of pressure is sustained in future elections. Further, as Mark noted, in several notorious human rights violating states, Iran and Venezuela amongst them, were defeated, even though they chose to run. Regrettably, however, some serious human rights violators, such as Cuba and China, were elected to the Human Rights Council. It is deeply unfortunate. Taken as a whole, the record of the Human Rights Council members, however, is something of an improvement over the Commission. In the Commission, 28% of the members were ranked as not free in Freedom House's annual ranking of political and civil liberties around the world. The Council, that percentage has dropped to just below 20%. It's an improvement, but more needs to be done. As you know, the U.S. chose not to run. We did so for principled reasons, having decided that given our no vote on the resolution creating the Council, we should not run for membership in the body. Also, we felt that there were strong candidates in our regional group that would uphold the values that we would have also promoted on the Council. As I stated earlier, the other major U.S. priority for the Council was maintaining a strong mandate for its action. Our highest objective was to preserve the ability to address violations of human rights in individual nations. One of the Council's essential tools in this regard is the ability to offer technical assistance. In urgent human rights situations, the Council may prevent a crisis by offering advisory services, technical assistance, and capacity building to states. Such assistance can address country situations through dialogue and cooperation with the affected parties. The United States is in the process of conferring closely and actively with partners on the Council to identify such situations where such aid would be useful. Another tool that this council has is the ability to call special sessions to discuss urgent human rights problems. The United States supported the concept of the special sessions in the negotiations to create the council, but argued, as Mark personally did, that the support of the majority of members should be required. The resolution, however, set out a requirement for the support of only 1/3 of the membership of the council. Regrettably, the Human Rights Council has successfully called for 2 special sessions. The first took place July 5th and 6th and addressed the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. The United States opposed the holding of this session, which focused only on Israel, while ignoring Hamas's and Syria's role and also overlooking the failure of the Palestinian Authority government to dismantle terrorist infrastructure. The second special session occurred on August 11th on the situation in Lebanon. The United States also strongly opposed the holding of this session and the resulting unbalanced Human Rights Council resolution that focused only on the actions of Israel and ignored the actions of Hezbollah that gave rise to the conflict. We have made clear to the countries that voted for the resolutions our serious concerns. We believe that the Human Rights Council must exercise its responsibility to promote and protect human rights even-handedly and globally. The decisions to hold these 2 special sessions and the imbalanced resolutions that they adopted were regrettable. If used properly to address egregious human rights violations, however, the United States firmly believes that the special session mechanism can be a valuable tool in the promotion and protection of human rights. We are prepared to support calls for future special sessions where there are serious and emerging human rights abuses, and we are actively discussing possibilities for such action with like-minded countries. Let me now describe one of the Council's most important tools for use when a country refuses to cooperate with the Council and the international community. In such cases, the Council retains the option of condemnatory resolutions. Such resolutions address egregious violations of rights and exhort states to make immediate reforms to remedy violations. Condemnatory resolutions by the Commission in the past have assigned special rapporteurs to monitor situations and report back to the Council. Future Council resolutions could and should contain similar mechanisms to address abuses. The United States very much supports resolutions that call to account the worst violators of the universally accepted human rights and fundamental freedoms of their people, especially those that refuse to cooperate with the Council and the international community. We are actively conferring with friends on the Council about when to pursue condemnatory resolutions. We have held dozens of meetings with like-minded counterparts to press hard for calling to account the most egregious human rights violators. In Helsinki and Geneva just last week, I held a series of meetings to press on this issue. Mark was in Geneva in April, May, and July and held similar meetings. Mr. Chairman, as Secretary Rice has said, the United States is committed to making the UN Human Rights Council strong and effective. This is essential because there are still repressive and bloodthirsty regimes that violate the fundamental human rights of their people and refuse the international community's help. The UN must be able to hold a mirror up to them and speak truth to power. The mandate of this council is clearly presented in its founding resolution text, where UN member states decided, quote, that the council should address situations of violations of human rights, including gross and systemic violations, and make recommendations thereon, unquote. We are working hard in a variety of ways to achieve that goal. The coming sessions and decisions of the Council will demonstrate whether the new body has the ability and, more importantly, the political will to protect and promote human rights more effectively and fairly than its predecessor. The United States remains committed to making the Council strong and effective. The cause for freedom, democracy, and the victims of human rights abuses globally require our best effort. In the weeks and months ahead, I look forward to continuing to consult with the members of this committee, with your staffs, with our partners in the NGO community and in the international community to undertake to make sure that the Human Rights Council executes its duties well and effectively. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, I'm sure, along with my colleague.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and both of you for your fine work on behalf of our nation, particularly as it relates to these issues. Let me begin with some questions. First on the pledges. I've read the responses of several of the countries as to what their pledges were, and with special emphasis on 2 that got elected, China and Cuba. I know that at the upcoming September 18th to October 6th session, there will be working groups reporting on how this universal periodic review will unfold. I don't know if their work has been completed, but I know we have been a part of that. And my question is, when does a country like China or Cuba or some other egregious violator, North Korea, although they're not on the council, get reviewed? Will it be 3 years down the line? Will it be 6 years down the line? Because they're allowed, obviously, 2 consecutive terms of office. To me, that's very, very important, because delay is denial, especially to the victims in a place like China. And I would just note parenthetically that this subcommittee, members, as I look to my right and to my left, have been roundly critical, as has been the administration and human rights watchdog groups, on China's barbaric behavior in a myriad of areas when it comes to human rights. Recently, I filed a petition along with Ben Cardin, along with the AFL-CIO, on the violation of workers' rights in China. The fact that there are no unions, that people are not paid, that they get 10 to 50 cents per hour, that the use of gulag or laogai labor, as it's known as, is widespread and pervasive. Child labor is pervasive. China is a country of particular concern because of its abuse of religious freedom. I know many people who are in prison today who are pastors, one of whom that I know quite well and met with when I was in China on one particular trip. A bishop remains in prison. He may even been executed, but we know that last sighting was that he was in prison, Bishop Xu of Baoding Province. We know that the forced abortion policy has wreaked unbelievable pain and agony upon the women of China, especially, that there is missing as many as 100 million girls, a gendercide, because one child is permitted, and girls have been eliminated systematically in China. We know the Uyghurs have been picked out as the Tibetan Buddhists for particularly harsh mistreatment. We know that they're using the internet to crack down on religious and political dissidents, people who just want to advocate democracy. We recently had a day-long hearing on the Global Online Internet Freedom Act, and especially as it relates to China. There's 35,000 estimated, 36,000 secret police combing the internet ways to try to discover anyone who writes an email that puts democracy or some other forbidden word into their email or their posting on the net. And yet they're a country in good standing. That, to me, is the height of hypocrisy. And I'm wondering, again, they've made a pledge. Their pledge was very, very soft and very nonspecific. A universal periodic review has to occur. When and what will it look like? When will countries like China be brought forth and really looked at? And again, I mentioned it in my opening. I've read Manfred Nowak's statement on China. It's an indictment on the use of torture in the PRC, and yet they sit on the council. It's mind-boggling.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to start by addressing a few China-specific questions and then turn to Mark to talk about the universal periodic review mechanism. As you've pointed out, there are serious and continuing human rights abuses in China. There are a number of ways that we are trying to address those issues in the administration, including the Assistant Secretary, my boss, Barry Lowenkron, for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, who has gone to China to have discussions with them on human rights and to talk to them about what we expect them to do before we are able to resume the human rights dialogue that has been suspended for a number of years because of some of the egregious problems that you yourself just pointed out. We have given them, in a number of discussions, including at various different levels in our government, up to and including the Secretary of State and the President, a series of steps that we would like them to take in order to resume that dialogue. We have discussed with them specific cases of individual prisoners, and we share your concerns about the need for them to demonstrate improvement so that we can then begin engaging bilaterally on a serious dialogue with them. However, we understand that that's not enough, and it needs to also be addressed in the international community and the multilateral questions, including through the Human Rights Council. We have talked with a number of our friends on the Council about when we should pursue specific country issues on the Council. Those discussions continue, and part of this is trying to figure out what makes sense to address when. Which is first out of the box. It will be important, but also how to get things through, because we want to make sure that the Council is effective. Those discussions are continuing, and I don't want to try and predict when China specifically will be addressed, but part of that also figures into, when will they come before the UPR as well. So I'll turn to Mark to address the questions on the Universal Periodic Review.
Thank you.
I, of course, share your moral and policy concern about China being addressed by the international community and by the UN mechanisms. With regard to the Universal Periodic Review, the idea of the proposed review would be that members of the Human Rights Council would be subject to the review earliest and first. It's designed to suggest, to answer the question, who are you to stand in judgment of others? It really does put some pressure on governments that are thinking of running that they might be subject to this review. It might have even led some countries like Sudan and Zimbabwe to think twice about running. It's important that China be among the first. There was a straw poll, a drawing of straws after the first election to create staggered elections for future years. And so some governments that won in the election got a 1-year seat, a 2-year seat, and a 3-year seat. It is the unfortunate outcome that a couple of governments like Poland and the Czech Republic only got 1 year, and a couple of governments like China and Cuba managed to get 3 years by that drawing of straws. That should not be an excuse for dictatorial governments to come later. It's important that all governments be treated and that it not only be the freedom-loving liberal societies of the West that are treated to the Universal Periodic Review first.
Let me just ask you with regards to definition. When any of us write a law or put a proposal forward, there's always a definition page which describes so that there's no ambiguity as to what we mean. What about the ambiguity about human rights and what the Human Rights Council will construe to be human rights? I note that Louise Arbour, in a statement, made a point of pointing out that she believes that the most serious human rights violation that we must confront is poverty. Now, I would generally put that under the humanitarian side of things and believe that we need to aggressively try to mitigate poverty anywhere and everywhere we see it. But if it becomes a placeholder that crowds out other human rights abuses, I think we have a problem. I remember in the early days when I first got elected 26 years ago, and we used to meet with the Soviets and talk about religious freedom, and again, talking about the crackdown on refuseniks and Soviet Jews and Pentecostals and others. They would immediately go to a talk about or a discussion about homelessness in America. And, it was like, okay, we addressed that, but that's not basically what the definition of human rights is all about. And so definitions, again, I think it's all important that we know exactly what we're talking about, which is why the treaties are so important as compared to summits and conferences and the like. And I've been at many of those conferences, I would just finally say, and very often the text of the conference document is written in advance. It always is written in advance. Some of the questionable language is bracketed. They work on the bracketed. And frankly, it's a process of wearing people out over the course of a week to get a consensus document, and everyone goes home and says, we did a great thing. That's hardly a method or methodology that leads to human rights that then need to be guarded and fought for. It is very, very, I think, slippery in the way some of those conferences are run. So I would ask you, definition. How do we get to a definition? And will the working groups address that?
The issue of economic, social, and cultural rights has been with us for a while. We embrace the Universal Declaration on Human Rights even though it cites economic, social, and cultural rights. But it's been our strong view that the character of those ideas is very different from political and civil rights. They are things protected. They're negative, bad outcomes of freedoms diminished that are protected in the concept of political and civil liberties. Economic, social, and cultural rights, in our view, should not be subject to judicial enforcement. We think that properly vested governments accountable to their people, representing the consent of the government, should provide for economic goods, should look out for the housing, diminution of hunger of their people, but these are not rights that the UN should be speaking to of the same character. this discussion, will clearly continue, and Arbor has fed it with her comment about this. It is true that in this body, with the increased number of African and Asian group members, will focus on economic and social and cultural rights. There is the definitional question, an important one. Additionally, there is the tactic used by some developing countries, and notably even some democratic governments within the developing world, to turn the discussion away from condemnatory resolutions that relate to political and civil liberties by focusing on questions of economic haves and have-nots within countries and economic haves and have-nots within the world. I'll just say one comment about conferences. We agree with you fervently that conferences and their outcome documents, their communiques, do not have the legal and weight within the international system that treaties do. This has been a problem that we have faced for some time in the General Assembly, and the old Commission on Human Rights is citing conferences, notably conferences like the Durban Conference on Racism that turned out to be a manifestation of racism and hate more than something to fight it. And yet we will continue to vigilantly fight inappropriate references that give it equal weight to treaties or instruments within the UN system.
Chairman Rohrabacher.
So, let's see, we've got now only 20% of the members of the body that will be passing judgments on human rights, only 20% of them are human rights abusers themselves. China and Cuba are still part of this body. I would suggest that, while the United Nations and while this council still has some value, and we should be at least utilizing a forum that exists, I would hope that we also caution our fellow Americans and others around the world not to place their faith in bodies that are composed, 20% of whom are composed of people who should be condemned by that body. And China, Chairman Smith and I have, for many years, pointed out the major human rights abuses, as he did today, in China. Yet our government, including this administration, continues with policies that assist American businessmen to invest in China. We still have guaranteed loans of people who are going to build factories in China. They still are guaranteed by instruments of the United States government. And while I commend both of you for an advocacy of a standard and a position, and I understand the moderation that you have, I think that I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to come to a hearing like this and be satisfied with my government. The government of Thomas Jefferson and the government of so much hope and so many values that we supposedly champion in the world. But I would commend both of you. You've said the right thing today. You've said the right thing. You're trying to go in the right direction. You are voices not only of moderation, but also of trying to accomplish what you can accomplish. So my only comments are what I just made, and I would just say good luck to you both, and do your very best. Try to make us proud to be Americans. We aren't proud if America isn't just a country that is a group of people who came from every corner of the world in order to come here and make money. We came here also to be a shining light of example of a type of standards of decency and liberty and justice that would hopefully have its impact in the world, not through our involvement in organizations flawed organizations like the United Nations, but instead as our example to the rest of the world. So you've got a lot to live up to, and you're trying to do a good job, so good luck to you.
Mr. Fortenberry.
That was a very powerful statement, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Rohrabacher, and I appreciate it because he's hinting at something that probably is beyond the framework of today's discussion about how on one side of our offices we promote policies that further economic relationships, and on the other side we condemn and try to uphold the fundamentals of human dignity around the world. And when those two virtues, when those two policies are in an impasse, we just sort of do them both. And how to reconcile that is an important policy discussion that I think needs to take place. Thank you for raising it. Chairman Smith actually addressed the two questions that I had for both of you, but I think it would be worthwhile going back and unpacking it a little bit further. Secretary Lagon, if you could go back to the Universal Periodic Review and just talk about the possibility of that being implemented. You seem to be indicating that this is a United States initiative, a U.S. initiative. Who are our allies in this regard, or is this process already underway through a large movement among council members, among the General Assembly, and what is its possibility of implementation? I think it is reasonable, perhaps this is the only enforcement mechanism that has any teeth, so that the new council simply doesn't become just a device for inflammatory rhetoric, and then we move on to other things. I'll stop there. I have a second question, though, I'd like to ask you both.
And some of your respective comments are so rich that we may want to comment, although you're right, that bigger question about those two virtues may be for some other hearing. On the Universal Periodic Review, on the Universal Periodic Review, I would not describe us as, from the outset, the champion of the Universal Periodic Review because we were skeptical. We were worried that it would be used to divert attention from condemnatory resolutions, and it would be an excuse used to suggest, oh, we haven't done the periodic review yet, so you can't have a resolution on a particular dictatorial country. However, it has great potential to add to the mechanisms of the human rights machinery of the UN if done right. We think it's important that states take some ownership of it, that there be responsibility by states, but it should not be allowed to be just the creature of a politicized debate or, frankly, the soft discussion between different developing countries or between countries with dictatorial governments to go easy on the record of their colleagues. It needs to be a serious effort to look at the record of certain countries without creating a heavy bureaucratized effort, which is always the sin of the UN, is to create something too bureaucratized. We mentioned that we're very concerned that technical assistance to countries in transition be offered, not only the important condemnatory resolutions to those particularly recalcitrant, bloodthirsty, and repressive governments, but governments in transition seeking technical assistance. We hope that this Universal Periodic Review does not become so bureaucratic that the Office of the High Commissioner and the whole human rights apparatus focuses on that and takes attention away from helping countries in the field so that those marginalized people are not assisted.
Well, perhaps one suggestion there could be that somebody who is graded or scored, and this is related to my second question as well, might be offered the opportunity to be moved into another category prior to the public discourse that takes place or the condemnation that takes place if they agree to certain types of technical assistance that will help correct those measures. Just an idea for your consideration.
Well, there are scores that are taken account of with the Millennium Challenge account, and I looked to our experts of the second panel. Brett Schaefer is associated with one score of the Index of Economic Freedom, and Jennifer Windsor with the excellent annual survey.
This is a good
Freedom
segue
House.
to the second part of the question, which the chairman has also touched upon. In your testimony, you suggested that the United States very much supports resolutions that call to account the worst violators of, quote, universally accepted human rights and fundamental freedoms of their people. Given the fluidity of the understanding of what that means, now we're talking about a scorecard, and you're talking about diversion into issues that might fall under the desired fruits of a stabilized society that has enshrined basic human rights. Where is this going to come from? Is the benchmark document still the Universal Declaration on Human Rights? Or again, is this process so fluid that it is very, very difficult to find an objective standard that talks about what I certainly believe, and I think most of us do believe, the immutable rights that are found in the very basic nature of persons as they lead to civil society and the other protected rights that we enjoy and some others around the world enjoy as well.
Thank you, Mr. Representative. We believe that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains an absolutely critical document to the upholding of a universal standard of individual freedoms, protections, and liberties. These are immutable rights for all individuals. And we believe that that standard, where governments have abused that standard, they do need to be brought to account. The new council offers a number of new mechanisms, but does not have a diminution of the condemnatory resolution mechanism from the Commission. There are ways of getting at countries that are serial abusers, serious human rights abusers, and those who refuse to cooperate with the international community, as you've suggested, when recommended they refuse to cooperate, whether that's with rapporteurs or whether technical assistance. There could be country-specific condemnatory resolutions, and we believe that that is an important mechanism for the Council to preserve and maintain, and that it is an important quiver, or arrow in the quiver of the Council. We believe that also the Universal Periodic Review could lead towards, if certain steps are recommended and the country refuses to take those steps and refuses to cooperate with technical assistance, that again, that could lead towards a more condemnatory stance by the Council. We believe also that there are places through special sessions where if there is an emerging situation, such as was faced in 1994 in Rwanda, where it is a serious and emerging threat, that with this new council now meeting not once for 6 weeks, and if you happen to run into a genocide in April, oh, sorry, we won't address that till next March. We now have the ability to call a special session to address that issue right then, right there, and to recommend action, whether that's referring the matter to the Security Council if that is appropriate for action there, or whether it is taking a condemnatory resolution, or there's a whole series of steps that could be taken. Likewise, in situations where countries are emerging from conflict, the recent situation with Liberia may be a case in point, where a country is taking steps but struggling to improve what has been a dire and very serious human rights situation, where a special session could be taken in a future resolution of a conflict to offer technical assistance to help them bridge the gaps, if you will, especially in cases where there are serious resource gaps for those countries. So there are a number of different mechanisms that would be available to this council to get at these questions. And it really comes back to the question I raised in my testimony of whether this council has the political will to use all those mechanisms to try and actually implement improvements on the ground. And that's where really the gold standard is going to be. Is this council able to actually make a difference on the ground?
One quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to see if you could provide the other measurements that you said that are out there, looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as kind of a core document, but you mentioned there are other measures floating out there. That would be interesting to me if you could provide that. I'd appreciate it. And secondly, one of you suggested in your testimony that the council's proceedings be moved from Geneva and from the comfortable surroundings of Geneva into the field. I think that's very astute. What if this perhaps moved around, or field offices, if you were held in various places? I think that's a very good recommendation, very practical. So.
We'll be happy to provide you with a list of the various different measures that are out there. I would recommend to you, of course, my Bureau's Human Rights Report, which we do on an annual basis, and also the Report on International Religious Freedoms, which is also done by the State Department, as well as the Trafficking in Persons Report, all of which feed into very basic and fundamental human rights. But we'd be happy to provide you with, we have great little CD-ROMs of those, and we'd also be happy to provide you with a list of other measures that we look at when we're looking at different countries' records.
I'm greatly confident in your work. Don't get me wrong. I'm looking at other possible notions that are out there that are challenging, again, what we consider to be immutable rights. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify my point about the field. My main point was, as this Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights enlarges, we want to make sure that it isn't just a Eurocentric think tank, and that when the Office of the High Commissioner is doing its technical assistance, it moves its resources and personnel out to its field offices rather than being only focused at the center.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Let
questions.
me just conclude with some final questions, and perhaps my colleagues might have a few additional ones. But what are we doing now with the OIC as relates to the possibility, and I would put it at probability, that even after this next session, they'll call for an additional special session on Israel? What is it likely will be the agenda, in addition to working groups reporting and rapporteurs on September 18th to October 6th? Will there be a focus on Darfur, where you have the Khartoum government in Bashir thumbing his nose at the international community and the UN peacekeeping force, and now, as we are reading every day, troop deployments into Darfur, more slaughters, more rapes of individuals who are innocent and certainly don't deserve that. I mean, if anything cries out for immediate UN Human Rights Council action, it would seem to me that Darfur should be first out of the blocks on September 18th. If not, why not? And let me just ask you, with regards to the resolution, said that the work and the functioning of the council could be reviewed within 5 years. Within doesn't mean at 5 years. Obviously, it means any time before that. I would hope that we would be looking to seriously go back and look at what was missed. And the General Assembly should be honest enough. Anytime we pass a law, we go back a year later. If something was missing, some gaping hole, we take a second look, reform provisions, go forward, hopefully to rectify that mistake or that overlooking of a provision that should have been in there. I would hope that we would be looking to do that, very, very soon, to try to correct some of these inequities. Finally, Mark Wallace, our U.S. Rep for UN Management, had called for the elimination of the Subcommission for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and its subsidiary bodies last spring because of its disregard of directives and guidance from its parent body, and because it reflected, according to our position, the U.S. position, the views mostly of the 24 experts, as opposed to what is basically settled human rights concern. So you get people moonlighting, writing reports, going onto tangents that is just their own personal view on something, and therefore it has the imprimatur of the UN body. How do they fit into all this, the subcommission? Where do they fit with the new council?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll try and address the first two of your questions and then turn to Mark for the second two structural questions. As regards the OIC, the OIC is not a monolith. They have 17 of the 47 members of the council are members of the OIC. This means that they have more than 1/3 of the membership and that they are able to call at will special sessions. We are realistic about what that means as far as the chances that there will be future Israel-focused special sessions. We, however, have seen that not all members of the OIC have voted consistently throughout the series of resolutions. There were 4, 2 in the first session and then 1 each in each of the special sessions on these resolutions against Israel. And we believe that there is not yet a cemented position by that group. Each country there has individual national interests, and we will continue to work with a number of those countries, including, importantly, some of those countries which are very strong democracies, to look at what is in their national interest and their own interest in having a strong, capable Human Rights Council that is actually able to work with them to address serious human rights abuses in their own regions. When I was out in Geneva last week, I had a couple of meetings with a number of those countries, and I think that there's reason to hope that we can work with some of them to get them to understand that the need for balance and globally, a global viewpoint of this Human Rights Council in the future. On Sudan and Darfur, we could not agree with you more that there is a very, very serious and ongoing human rights problem in Darfur. As you know, this administration has been very forward-leaning, leading the world in calling what was happening there genocide, and calling attention to it and focusing very, very serious attention, not only bilaterally, but by the entire international community on the situation there. Our Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Jendai Fraser, was in Khartoum last week, discussing the situation there with the government and trying to get them to address some of these issues. We will work with our colleagues throughout the government to decide when it's appropriate to bring these issues to various bodies in the UN system. There's not only the UN Human Rights Council, but obviously the Security Council is also engaged in this matter, and we want to make sure that we are addressing all pieces and parts, the security part of this, but also the human rights part of this conflict as we move forward. And the obvious problem that is caused by the AU peacekeepers there having their mandate run out soon, and the inability of UN peacekeepers to go in behind is a first and foremost concern for our government. We remain very, very engaged on that, and obviously that will have implications on the human rights situation, but we will also remain engaged on the very serious human rights situation that is there.
I appreciate it. Just briefly again on Darfur, will there be an attempt made at the upcoming meeting of the Human Rights Council? Obviously it provides an additional venue to put pressure on Khartoum to allow those blue-helmeted peacekeepers in, the 21,000 or so. It seems to me that right now they have a window of opportunity, as they see it, to do incredible mischief and killing. Their troops are being deployed. I don't know how many. I've seen 20, 30,000, 10,000. I don't know what the exact number is. And as we talk, at least we have an additional area of engagement with the UN Human Rights Council, and we are observers. Could we make that request?
It is going to have to see. We're going to have to see how things evolve, quite frankly, in the next 2 weeks as we go forward. We're obviously at a critical moment here, and we'll see how things evolve in the next 2 weeks to see if we're able to move forward with something in the Security Council, and then to see how that meshes with something in the Human Rights Council. I don't want to say definitively yes or no because I don't think we know right now, and we'll have to see how things evolve in the next 2 weeks. But we've been working very closely. I had a discussion just this morning with Jendai Fraser about this to try and see how we can best make this situation stay on the front burner of the international agenda, because it is absolutely critical that the international community, not just the U.S. and not just our partners who have been working very hard for peace in Darfur, engage, but the entire international community, including Sudan's neighbors. And importantly, I think we also need to look at the OIC and some of the member states there. I'll be going out to Egypt next week, and we'll be raising this with the government of Egypt as well.
I had a couple of questions from Chairman Smith I wanted to respond to. Did you want to follow up with Erica, or? Okay. I wanted to respond to your question about the 5-year review and the elimination of the subcommission. I take your point, just as you with legislation, refine earlier versions of legislation, like in dealing with the grossly dehumanizing phenomenon of trafficking in persons, with the reauthorizations, have improved, filled holes, dealt with problems. One could look at the problems of the Human Rights Council before the 5-year review. We will look at that option. Our thought had been that at the 5-year point, that would be the juncture set out in the resolution creating the Human Rights Council to decide whether it should become a principal body of the UN. Our main consideration is to see what the record is of the Human Rights Council. We will not allow it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that we consider the Council problematic and not better than the Commission on Human Rights. But that was the main test that was designed for 5 years from now. But there may be some steps that the General Assembly could take in the meantime. With regard to the subcommission, we have indeed, both as a budgetary matter and a matter of a review of all UN programs to see which are duplicative, stated in New York, as Ambassador Wallace did, that the subcommission should be eliminated, and vigorously in the discussions of mandates in Geneva under the auspices of the Human Rights Council suggested that the current subcommission that still exists, despite the fact the Commission on Human Rights is gone, is completely unmoored. There's not only the problem that you cite of some experts on the committee having gone far afield from the intended mandates of the principal body, but there are members of that committee who are ostensibly independent experts but are really the agents, the instruments of dictatorial governments that they're associated with. Our view is that there should be no successor body, that the old job of the subcommission was to create norms, and just as Secretary General Annan and the High Commissioner Arbor have said, we should look at implementation. If there is any successor body of experts, it should only be dealing with implementation questions, some advice on technical assistance that would be most appropriate to help countries. But our first choice and what we're advocating strongly is that subcommission be eliminated and not replaced.
Dana?
I would just like to make sure that the record indicates that I understand the chairman has a special place in his heart for Israel, as do most Americans, but let me just note, Mr. Chairman, that I think it's absolutely right for this organization, whether you call it a council, Human Rights Council, or whatever you want to refer to it as, or just us as a people, to hold Israel accountable on the same standard we hold everyone else accountable. And I know it's become almost a gut reaction from us, because in the past, the hypocrisy and double standards that have been used in order to condemn Israel. You have tyrants condemning Israel for not treating the Palestinians correctly and giving them their political rights. But at the same time, we do have to recognize there has been in this conflict millions of people, Palestinians, who have for decades not enjoyed the political freedoms and liberties that we expect ordinary citizens to have, the right to vote and determine their own government. Instead, they've been held in limbo because Israel itself did not know what it wanted to do with Gaza and the West Bank. And I think that Israel in the last year has made a decision that they cannot have the West Bank and Gaza incorporated into Israel without incorporating millions of Palestinians, which is not what they want to do, because that would destroy the nature of what they set out to do back in 1948, which is essentially have an Israeli Jewish state that Jews around the world could look to as their homeland. But just for the record's sake, I want to make sure that everyone, at least for this congressman, liberty and justice is one standard. And I would applaud Israel right now for trying to make those moves and make that decision that will permit the Palestinian people in the end to have their own homeland if they choose not to use it as a springboard to attack Israel itself. So we're going through this period, but we do believe that the Palestinian people have a right to direct their government through the consent of the governed, just like everybody else. And it's and some of the criticism in the past of Israel, while hypocritical coming from dictatorships, some of it would have been justified in coming from people who do believe in democracy and human rights for all. So let us hope that, and in fact, as I say, I think Israel in the last year has made some fundamental decisions trying to set up Gaza as an example of where the Palestinians and the West Bank, of how some self-government could be brought to bear. And unfortunately, it's been a very rocky road this first year, but let's hope they evolve in the right way. But I just want to make sure that whoever's reading this transcript around the world understands that we do hold Israel accountable to the same standards as everybody else in terms of human rights. And just thought I'd put that in the record.
My friend, yield briefly. I do think it should be noted, and I will put in the record the two resolutions from the special session on July 5th to 6th and August 11th. The problem, and I thought I made it very clear in my opening, was that they were incredibly one-sided, made no mention of Hezbollah, no mention of Hamas, no mention of Iran or Syria or any other interest. And if you read it, it's just Israel and Israel only, and they are the ones who are at fault for everything. In addition to that...
Excuse me, is that at fault for the current crisis?
Yes, both crises.
I happen to be supportive of Israel in the current situation. I think they've done what's right. They were fired upon, and they couldn't sit back and allow rockets to be lobbed into Israel, but that would be justified. But I do think that it is not necessary to criticize everybody in order to criticize Israel at the same time. However, in this case, you're putting it in the proper context, so I think that's absolutely correct.
And in addition to that, my deep concern is that there are human rights violations being committed with impunity all over the world by many of the same players who are sitting as members of good standing of the Human Rights Council. China comes to mind, Cuba comes to mind, and others, Saudi Arabia, which is also a country of particular concern because of its egregious violations of religious freedom, to mention just one violation, and yet nothing there. I mean, it begs the question, because that's what happened. Those of us who would go to Geneva every year to the Human Rights Commission meetings were taken by the disproportionate amount of angst leveled against the Israelis vis-a-vis the rest of the world. China, we would have resolutions of no action because they were able to lobby members sitting on that commission, very often with very lucrative contracts and the like. They use trade as a weapon to keep them from joining on with the United States or others in motions to condemn Chinese barbaric actions on human rights. Even when we got to places like Darfur, there were efforts to lessen the severity of the resolution. These are only words. So what we're asking for is an end to the hypocrisy and the preoccupation with bashing Israel. As I think Dr. Lagon pointed out, the hate fest that occurred in Durban under the auspices of the UN, it was not about tolerance, it was all about hatred and vitriol leveled against Jews, and it was anti-Semitic like no other conference probably ever run under the auspices of the UN. So that's the concern, but I appreciate your comments, I really do. Would anyone else like to?
We appreciate your comments on this. You're right, all nations should be subject to scrutiny, all member states of the UN, Israel and the United States included. But what we're concerned about is that when there is a double standard, as Chairman Smith describes, a disproportionate focus on Israel and a focus in the UN human rights machinery that does not advance the likelihood of peace and an outcome of vision that the President has spoken of two states living in peace with democratic governance, including the democratic governance of the Palestinian people you refer to.
I want to thank our two distinguished witnesses again for your leadership and for providing us with your insights and counsel today.
Very glad to join you.
I'd like to now welcome our second panel, beginning with Brett Schaefer, who is a J. Kingham Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. As a Foreign Policy Research Fellow, Mr. Schaefer covers the United Nations and affiliated organizations to evaluate their performance and effectiveness. He has authored nearly 100 public policy papers and over 45 book chapters, articles, and opinion pieces. We'll then hear from Hillel Neuer, who is the Executive Director of the UN Watch, a non-governmental organization based in Geneva, Switzerland. He is a leading commentator on UN human rights reform, appearing often on CNN and the BBC. As a former international lawyer, the U.S. District Court of New York cited Mr. Neuer for his superb work in human rights advocacy. We'll then hear from Jennifer Windsor, who is the Executive Director of Freedom House and oversees a staff of 100 with numerous offices around the world. Previously, Ms. Windsor served for 9 years with USAID, where she most recently was the Deputy Assistant Administrator and Director of the Center for Democracy and Governance in the Global Bureau. In addition, Ms. Windsor is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Morton H. Halperin, who is the Executive Director for Open Society Policy Center. He works closely with U.S. policy abroad to promote human rights and support for open societies. Previously, Dr. Halperin served as a Senior Director for Democracy at the National Security Council. In addition, Dr. Halperin spent many years with the American Civil Liberties Union. Mr. Schaefer, if you could begin.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for providing me with the opportunity to testify on the state of the new United Nations Human Rights Council and how it compares with its predecessor, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. My testimony is a bit long for the time permitted, and I will be summarizing my remarks. With permission, I would like my full statement submitted for the record.
Without objection, yours and all of our witnesses will be made a part of the record.
Thank you. Since the very birth of the United Nations, protecting and advancing fundamental human rights has been one of the primary objectives of the organization. The drafters of the UN Charter included a pledge by member states to, quote, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in equal rights of men and women. UN treaties such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which the General Assembly passed in 1948, form the core of international standards for human rights. Yet the UN's record on promoting fundamental human rights in recent times has been one of failure and inaction. No institution illustrated this failing more than the Commission on Human Rights, which in recent years devolved into a feckless organization that human rights abusers use to block criticism or action to promote human rights. For instance, members with dubious human rights records elected to the Commission in recent years have included Algeria, China, Cuba, Syria, Zimbabwe. Libya served as chairman of the Commission in 2003. Sudan was elected to the Commission in 2004 despite its actions in Darfur. The Commission has also focused disproportionately on condemning Israel. By contrast with that country, human rights violations in Sudan, China, Cuba, and other nations have been subject to minimal scrutiny. The disrepute of the Commission grew to the point where even Secretary General Kofi Annan acknowledged, we have reached the point at which the Commission's declining credibility has cast a shadow on the reputation of the United Nations system as a whole. The Secretary General recommended replacing the Commission with a smaller Human Rights Council, able to meet when necessary, possessing stronger standards for membership, and charged with reviewing the human rights practices of every UN member state. The first test to see if the Council would surpass the Commission came last fall. The 2005 World Summit Outcome document did follow through on the Secretary General's proposal to replace the Commission with the Council. However, the details of the Council, including its mandate, operation, size, membership, working methods, and procedures, were left to subsequent negotiation. These negotiations fell considerably short of the proposals by the Secretary General, non-governmental organizations, the United States, and other countries interested in making the body a more effective forum for discussing and protecting human rights than the Commission. For instance, the criteria had no criteria for membership aside from geographical representation. Members of the Council are elected by an absolute majority of the General Assembly, not the two-thirds majority sought by the Secretary General in the United States. The resolution set a higher bar to suspend a Council member, a vote of two-thirds of the General Assembly, than the simple majority necessary to win a seat. When the Council is charged with conducting while the Council is charged with conducting a universal periodic review, the conclusions of the review would not prevent those countries found complicit in human rights violations from participating in the Council. The Council, at 47 members, is only marginally smaller than the previous Commission. These failings led the U.S. to vote against the Council in the General Assembly and decide not to run for a seat in 2006, although it announced that it would continue its financial support and consider running in 2007 if the Council approved its merit. Significantly, well-known human rights abusers such as Burma, China, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, Zimbabwe all voted in favor of the new Council. The second test for the new Council to see if it's going to surpass the standards, admittedly rather low standards, of the Commission was the May 9th election process for the Council. The election validated U.S. concerns that the new Council lacked criteria to prevent major human rights abusers from gaining seats. Prior to the election, candidates offered pledges for their adherence to human rights standards and justifications for the candidacy. These public statements were in many instances absurd in their deviance from historical record. For instance, the Chinese government pledged that it is, quote, committed to the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Chinese people. The National People's Congress has adopted nearly 300 laws and regulations related to the protection of civil and political rights, ensuring complete freedom of the Chinese people in movement, employment, access to information, religious belief, and ways of life. Cuba claims that either in the area of civil or political rights, the Cuban people can show the world with deep modesty but with full satisfaction and pride its tremendous achievements. These claims obviously are refuted by the State Department's Human Rights Report and also by the exercises and admirable efforts by a number of NGOs focused on human rights issues. The General Assembly had the opportunity to prevent human rights abusers from gaining seats on the Council, but it did not take advantage of it. Despite promises by a number of nations to vote against human rights abusers, the membership on the Council remains only marginally better than the Commission. The transparently disingenuous nature of their pledges did not keep China or Cuba from winning seats on the Council. These countries were key players in undermining the effectiveness of the Commission, and it is very likely that they will continue to perform this role on the Council. The Council faced a third test in its first session this past June. The session was marked by procedural issues designed to carry on many of the operations of the Commission. For instance, the Council extended the mandates established by the Commission and that are carried out by independent human rights experts. The Council also established a working group to begin to consider how the Universal Periodic Review of human rights performance in all UN member states should operate, how often countries should be reviewed, and where to begin the reviews. This modest action was very disappointing. The Universal Periodic Review process was considered the most important achievement that would keep the Council from following in the footsteps and repeating the worst weaknesses of the Commission. It remains unknown whether the system that is ultimately established will conduct its assessments of human rights practices with the frequency and frankness that will make the Council a true improvement over the Commission. Similarly, it remains uncertain as to the extent of the mandates, as to what extent the mandates and rapporteurs will be scrutinized, or if the Council will undertake to tighten their mandates. But the singular failure of the first Council session was its treatment of Israel. On this subject, the Council proved itself to be just as vulnerable to politicization and selective judgment as the Commission. In an extended déjà vu session, the Council, led by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, repeatedly singled out Israel for censure, despite the efforts of a number of countries on the Council. I'll wrap up my remarks with a few suggestions, and I'll be welcome questions from the committee. The hope that the new Human Rights Council would rectify the poor record of the Commission has thus far proven illusory. While the Council has the potential to be a stronger body than its discredited predecessor, such an outcome depends entirely on the actions of its members. There is no standard by which there will be an absolute certainty that the Council will not repeat the mistakes of the past. Based on the short record of the Council, the members have decided to turn their back on this opportunity and chosen to repeat many of the serious mistakes of the Commission. This disappointing situation underscores the wisdom of the Bush administration in taking a wait-and-see attitude toward the Council. The Council will convene again this September, later this year in December, and again next March. All of these sessions present opportunities for the Council to improve, and the U.S. should continue to work with Council members to ensure that the Council members with the worst human rights records be the first to be subject to the periodic reviews. There will be enormous pressure to water down the peer review process. One way to quickly gauge how useful that process will be is to have the countries with the worst human rights records, those most interested in whitewashing their reviews, assessed first. Second, the U.S. should seek to maintain the country-specific mandates. Countries with poor human rights records have been transparent in their desire to have the country-specific mandates minimized. However, these mandates provide a valuable means for addressing gross, systematic, and sustained human rights abuses by singling out individual nations. Finally, the review of the mandate should strive to more tightly define and focus the scope under consideration. If Council members change course and demonstrate that they are determined to make the body an effective advocate for fundamental human rights, should the U.S. consider running for a seat next year. If the peer review process, the review of mandates continues to fall short, if the disgraceful politicization of the Council persists, it would be a telling sign that the Council is not worth the trouble of rallying support necessary for the United States to win a seat. Moreover, it should lead the United States to reconsider its financial support for the Council. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. I'll await your questions.
Mr. Schaefer, thank you very much. Mr. Neuer.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of testifying. Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of testifying at today's hearing on a vital international issue, the universal protection of human rights. UN Watch, the NGO that I direct, is dedicated to holding the UN accountable to its own charter principles and to promoting human rights for all. UN Watch was founded by a leading advocate of the civil rights movement, the late Morris Abram, following his term as U.S. ambassador to the UN in Geneva. We continue to be based in Geneva and actively participate in proceedings of the UN human rights apparatus that is headquartered there. The new Human Rights Council was widely hailed by proponents as, quote, the dawn of a new era. So far, however, it looks virtually the same as, and in some ways worse than, its discredited predecessor, the Human Rights Commission. Let me be clear. Modest progress is still possible. As mentioned, annual elections allow for scrutiny of candidates, enabling the defeat of a few human rights violators, as happened this year with Iran. The Council is working on a universal review mechanism meant to examine the rights records of all countries equally. If achieved, and if that process will mean more than having the Saudis fill out a questionnaire assuring the UN of its commitment to women's rights, or the Castro regime of its respect for freedom of speech, this would be an improvement. In certain areas, then, with a great deal of hard work and moral courage, one can imagine a future that is somewhat brighter. But if we look honestly at the reality so far, at the existing facts, the record speaks for itself. Despite holding 3 sessions that purported to address substantive human rights issues, the Council managed to ignore virtually all of the world's human rights violations. The situation in Darfur, perhaps today's greatest abuse of human rights, merited only a brief passing debate, with Sudan easily escaping censure. Despite urgent warnings of even worse atrocities to come, there has been not a single attempt by Council members to convene a special session for the millions of victims in Darfur. Nor am I aware of a single Council member that intends to introduce a resolution for the victims of Darfur or anywhere else at the upcoming September session. Mr. Chairman, as you rightly mentioned, instead, the Council, which is dominated by countries from the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the OIC, devoted 100% of its country-specific resolutions to special sessions, one, quote, fact-finding mission, and a, quote, high-level commission of inquiry to one single purpose, the demonization of Israel. In these one-sided and politically motivated attacks, the Council decided that Israel is the world's only human rights violator. It said not a word about Hamas and Hezbollah, not a word about their murderous attacks across international borders, not a word about the role of Iran and Syria, as was mentioned, in coordinating the axis of terror that now threatens the peace of the region and indeed the peace of the world. These resolutions encourage extremists and are counterproductive to the cause of peace and human rights. Just like at the old Commission, we have a pack of repressive regimes at the Council that shamelessly hounds Israel at every opportunity. What is disturbing, however, is that several free countries have also decided to, in Senator Moynihan's memorable words, join the jackals. UN Watch is disappointed that democratic states like India, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay all lent their support for the OIC initiatives, each of which contravenes the founding principles of the Council and, taken together, amount to an assault on its very integrity. In the report released today by UN Watch, these countries are designated as being counterproductive to the cause of human rights. The attitude of the Council has negatively influenced related entities. Last month, the UN's Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination called its own special session on the Lebanon crisis on the pretext that Israel was acting out of, quote, racist motives, though a few members rightly objected that the crisis was completely outside the panel's mandate. This was to no avail. All of this on the same day that Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad renewed his bloodthirsty call for the destruction of the Jewish state. Then there was the Council's Advisory Subcommission. It is prohibited by its own rules from addressing specific countries, but law and precedent went out the window in the rush to condemn Israel, and it too intervened with a one-sided statement on the situation in Lebanon. Not a word on Hezbollah's missile attacks against Israeli civilians, not a word on Israeli victims. The member from the United Kingdom warned they would be, quote, breaking the rules, but to no avail. In the end, even she joined the jackals. When I protested to one of the subcommission members, with a chuckle, he replied, "And do you think the Council will admonish us?" The Organization of the Islamic Conference and its allies, the countries that sponsor and support the demonization of Israel, are the same that sponsor and support attacks on democracy. At a time when the world is threatened by re-emergent terrorist groups acting in the name of global jihad, the OIC-controlled council further encouraged extremists by adopting a resolution against, quote, defamation of religions. This was, in fact, a thinly veiled endorsement of the fury of violence that followed the Danish newspaper cartoon controversy. For the past year, the OIC has assiduously stoked this fury by demanding and winning repeated pronouncements from the High Commissioner, independent experts, and the Council. Indeed, the very charter of the Council, the GA resolution adopted in March, is tainted by its own thinly veiled approval of the violent reactions to the cartoon controversy. It's in the preamble. These OIC-sponsored texts are meant to intimidate domestic dissidents by characterizing liberal democracy as blasphemy. Mr. Chairman, there were warnings about all of this, but the response too often was complacency. For 2 months prior to its opening, the Council held preliminary meetings in Geneva to plan its agenda. I was there. Hypocrisy was rampant, yet no country bothered to respond. Saudi Arabia, whose school books teach hatred of all non-Muslim infidels, pronounced itself on, quote, incitement of religious hatred. Syria, which held Lebanon under its jackboot for decades, urged special attention to the crimes of occupation. The Palestinian Observer, who answers to the Hamas terrorist leadership, opined about human rights. The response? Silence. This sent a message. There were many other negative signs. The Council, in its wisdom, decided to renew as one of its experts Mr. Jean Ziegler, the man who, in 1989, co-founded the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize, an award that, in 2002, he went on to win himself, together with convicted French Holocaust denier Roger Garaudy. Mr. Ziegler has abused his post as expert on the right to food, neglecting the world's hungry, to pursue a radical political agenda, regularly accusing the United States of causing all the world's misery and of committing genocide against Cuba. Last year, he compared Israel to Nazi Germany. Allow me to salute you, Mr. Chairman, and the 69 other members of Congress who wrote to the UN to protest this anti-Semitic act. The old commission was most famously and fatally discredited by its election of Libya as chair in 2003, as was mentioned. Now, as one of its first acts, the Council has appointed Gaddafi's man at the UN to be one of its experts. This, too, sent a message. Mr. Chairman, to conclude, despite unfounded claims of a new era, the goal of real reform remains elusive. Only by honestly addressing both the Council's strengths and weaknesses will the cause of reform be advanced. Complacency in the face of this serious crisis of credibility will only lead the Council down the same ignominious path of the old Commission. But if we act now with conviction and alacrity, the Council may yet meet a better fate. Thank you.
Mr. Neuer, thank you very, very much. Ms. Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to testify here today and for convening this important hearing. As we've heard, the current situation related to the UN Human Rights Council presents a quandary for all of us who care about the restoration and strengthening of the UN's role in promoting human rights. While there has been some important progress and reform in a number of areas, there have also been some real disappointments, many of which have been laid out by my colleague from the Heritage Foundation. This mixed record to date forces a strategic decision. Do we all distance ourselves until we are certain whether the Council will in fact deliver, or engage more actively in the hopes of doing what we can to ensure it doesn't fail? First, while Freedom House has had very serious concerns it's put on the record, we believe that the potential for the Council's success is not yet lost. But that potential will be realized only if the U.S. government and other democratic countries strengthen their efforts to engage and collaborate. As you can see from the attachments to my testimony, perhaps the most significant positive aspect of the new Council is that a preponderance of states professing a commitment to democracy and ranked by Freedom House as free in our annual survey of freedom make up the current membership. Indeed, over 75% of the Council's members belong to the community of democracies. The constraints and challenges are also obvious. The lack of more specific criteria for memberships still resulted in almost a dozen countries ranked as not free, elected to the Council. Freedom House also shares the concerns previously mentioned here today about the unbalanced focus on Israel alone in the last two special sessions while ignoring the human rights violations of non-state actors including Hamas, Hezbollah, and their state sponsors. The Council needs to prove that it can act and that it can live up to its potential. The effectiveness of the Council will be judged, perhaps most importantly, on its willingness and ability to take action, including utilizing country-specific resolutions to address the most pressing human rights violations around the world. And we endorse what the administration, the focus that the administration has put on that earlier today. In terms of what the Council should focus on in terms of countries, we have released today our annual compilation of a document called The Worst of the Worst. These are the most repressive countries in the world, according to our annual survey of political rights and civil liberties that we have been doing every year for 30 years. This survey, in reference to the Congressman's earlier question related to a survey based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is in fact drawn from that declaration. We believe that these situations described here represent the minimal to-do list in terms of priority country action. And I would mention, in addition to the Darfur region, which has been already mentioned, the issue of North Korea, where hundreds of thousands of citizens are held in political gulags, others face torture and arbitrary execution, as well as Burma, where the military junta continues to carry out extrajudicial executions, detaining freely elected leaders, and carrying out forced relocation of ethnic minorities. We also believe that the new procedure for removing members of the Council who commit, quote, gross and systematic violations of human rights must be put in place. Without any procedures to put in place, there can be no action to remove Council members. And we believe that the situation in a number of member states, including China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia, clearly meet that standard for removal. Finally, we believe that the Council needs to address a worrying trend that directly impacts the human rights situations in many countries. The number of governments that are issuing laws, regulations, and taking actions designed to restrict freedom of association, assembly, and information of their own citizens. Freedom House is working with other groups to try to raise the importance and profile of this issue. Key to the Council's future success will be the leadership role played by the members of the community of democracies, which comprise something called the UN Democracy Caucus, as you well know. To date, Democracy Caucus members have yet to adequately act on opportunities to advance human rights at the United Nations. Some of them, including, unfortunately, the current leadership, the government of Mali, have abstained or voted against UN General Assembly resolutions on some of the worst abusers. And Council vote tallies indicate that others did not abide by their pledge to vote for those countries that met clear human rights standards. I want to use the remaining portion of my time to address the role of the U.S. government, which unfortunately is not a member of the Council, having decided not to present itself as a candidate for Council membership. We believe that this has severely limited the impact and influence of the U.S. government's diplomatic efforts. I want to start by saying that I have the highest respect for the two administration officials that testified here today. They are both enormously talented professionals. But while they have persuasively outlined how the administration has been working diligently behind the scenes, the U.S. government has clearly missed important opportunities. If the U.S. is to be persuasive and effective with the Council, the administration needs to communicate clearly that the Council is a priority and design and implement a worldwide, politically fine-tuned and tirelessly carried out strategy, not just work through New York, Geneva, and other regular representatives. The U.S. has some of the most talented diplomats in the world. We're the world's only remaining superpower. Why are we continuing to fail to persuasively engage the international community in promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms at the UN? Finally, as today's hearings reinforce, we believe that the U.S. Congress has an important and valuable role to play in strengthening the Council. We do not believe that that role should include conditioning funding for the United Nations on the Council's performance, which we think would in fact be counterproductive. Rather, our energies should be devoted to encouraging a more effective, not necessarily more bellicose, diplomacy from the U.S. government, and to raise directly with other democratic governments, many of whom request meetings with yourself and other members of Congress, on the importance of ensuring the Council take effective action against country-specific human rights violations. For its part, Freedom House will continue to engage in the work of the Council, particularly in facilitating the access of human rights defenders and democracy activists to that body, in order to directly provide information on situations where infringements and violations of internationally recognized freedoms are occurring. Mr. Chairman, we look forward to working together to catalyze the efforts of the U.S. government and other democratic members of the Council to ensure that the new Human Rights Council's actions in the future restores and indeed strengthens the role of the UN in protecting human rights around the world. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very, very much for your testimony and the work of Freedom House. Dr. Halperin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee, and I want to commend you for holding the hearings. And I am heartened by the fact that it seems to be a consensus among all of those who have testified to the 3 points which I began my written statement with and which I would ask be made part of the record. And that is, first, that the UN Human Rights Council can play an important role, as do other parts of the UN, in protecting those struggling for their human rights around the globe. Second, that the early returns from the Council are at best mixed, and that in particular there must be deep concern about the actions against Israel, which have been widely discussed. But the third, that it is far too soon to give up on the Council. The Council can get better, and that requires American leadership. And I think, despite the efforts that have been described, we need more effective American leadership, and I want to come to that at the end of my testimony. I do want to leave no doubt that the Open Society Policy Center joins the other witnesses and the members of the committee in condemning the one-sided attacks on Israel and the failure of the Council to condemn the clear human rights violations by Hamas and Hezbollah. And also, I think one needs to express concern about the fact that special sessions were called on the Middle East, but not on Darfur, when I think it is clear that the human rights situation in Darfur is deteriorating and is an urgent emergency situation. If the United States were on the Council, I would say it should call for a special session and try to get a third of the members. We can do that anyway as a non-member, and I would hope that we would do that. It's because it seems to me if there ever is a need for a special session, it is for what is happening now in Darfur. But I think as we think about the Council, we need to remind ourselves about the important work that's been done and that's been mentioned by all the other witnesses, the special sessions, the special rapporteurs, the drafting of human rights standards, which play an important role in affecting other governments, and the fact that the Council, as the Commission before it, is more open to NGO participation than any other part of the UN and sets a standard that I think we should seek to emulate in other parts of the UN system. I think we need to recognize that the first session was primarily procedural, and therefore it is far too soon to say that the universal review, for example, cannot be effective. As has been said, a major reason to try to change from the Commission to the Council was the fact that many members had been elected to the Commission who should not serve on it. But I think it's also been noted there has been substantial progress. There is a very different election procedure, and the Council is better than the Commission. The only country I want to comment on that was elected was China. I share the concern about the election of China, and the view that China should not sit on the Council. And I'm pleased to see that the members of the subcommittee seem to share that view. But I wonder whether you would also agree that nobody who has advocated the notion that China is entitled to a seat on the Council should be representing the United States at the UN. That is, I think, a matter of deep concern. Let me turn finally to the question of what the United States should do in moving ahead. First, I think that we should appoint a special envoy. A number of NGOs have joined in proposing to the Secretary of State that she appoint a special envoy, not only to represent the United States at the actual Council sessions, but in between those sessions to visit the other members of the Council and to work to make it a better body. We have not done that. It meant that we have been underrepresented in Geneva. We've been represented by an ambassador, even when other countries send their ministers to the opening session. And I think one way to clearly signal our determination to try to make the Council work is to appoint a special envoy. Second, I think we need to do much more to invigorate the Democracy Caucus at the Council. Mali has not called a meeting in Geneva. I think we should be pressing them to do so. As I've said, we should be seeking an early special session on Darfur, but also seeking resolutions at the Council on countries such as North Korea and Sudan, which have currently engaged in extensive human rights violations. Finally, it seems to me not too soon for the United States to announce that it will seek a seat on the Council at the next election, and also to begin working to get more democratic countries to seek seats on the Council. The way to defeat Cuba, as Venezuela and Iran was defeated, Saudi Arabia and others, is to get democratic countries from each region to seek the seats and to actively campaign on their behalf. And the election is not for a while, but it is not too soon for us to begin that process. Mr. Chairman, let me thank you again for the opportunity to appear, and of course I'm prepared to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Halperin. Let me just ask you, you did raise the question of someone, I guess in the U.S. mission, had recommended China. Well, who was that?
That was Ambassador Bolton, who, in an interview with the Washington Post, stated his belief that all of the permanent members of the Security Council were entitled to seats on the Human Rights Council, and indeed, he said, on all other human rights bodies. And a number of ambassadors have commented that our effort to keep off serious human rights abuses was seriously undercut by that statement by Ambassador Bolton.
Okay, I would have to
I'd be glad to provide
I'll
that article for the record.
I'll get the site as soon as I go back to my office. But I thank you for raising that, because I, for one, would agree with you wholeheartedly that it's all about performance and deeds, not paper promises. And Mr. Schaefer, you know, I had read the comment or the statement of the Chinese, their pledge, which is a nothing burger. I mean, they say those kinds of things every time you meet with anyone in Beijing or any of their representatives here, including their ambassador. 300, as you pointed out, 300 policy enacted by the People's Congress, when you get down to it, aren't worth the paper they're printed on, because there's no transparency, there's nothing to it, unfortunately. So thank you for that, all of you. I want to thank all of you for your testimonies. I mean, they were very, very powerful. This is the first in a series of hearings. In a few months, probably late November, early December, we will hold another hearing to take another look at how well or poorly the Human Rights Council is doing, and then hopefully that will continue right into next year. Because I would agree with all of you that we need to make this work, and so far dysfunction, regrettably, is what we're seeing, and not something that victims and their advocates can be truly happy about. Let me just ask a very brief question about the review. One of our witnesses, I think, made a very good point that violators should be first in line for that review, and I think we need to. Would all of you agree with that? That China and Cuba, Saudi Arabia should be first in the dock, if you will.
The issue is one of tactics. There is obviously an argument for that, and as I said, those countries, I think, need to be subject to a review as fast as possible. But there's also an argument that I think can be made that some of the countries that are good performers can set the standard for others by volunteering to go first, so that you really have this mechanism actually working as opposed to have it undermined right from the beginning. So I would say that it would be useful to also have perhaps countries that you wouldn't cite, like the Czech Republic, volunteering to go first and then comparing how they do their review and how they handle it with a country like Cuba and China and how they handle their own review.
Yes.
I think we have to pick our fights and figure out what is most sensible here. I am not sure that we're not better off waiting to set a standard by the first year or two of review and have China come up later after we've refined the process, and to then subject them to it in a way that we can say was set by the standards of other countries. It would not be crazy to say that the countries that only have a one-year term need to be reviewed first because they're only going to be on the council for a year. And I don't think we can say in advance the bad countries should go first, because the purpose of the review presumably is to find out what the human rights record are of each country. We think we know the answer to that, but I think that making the process work effectively may be more important than trying to get all the countries that we think should be first to go first.
I think, Mr. Chairman, that in principle, having human rights violators go under review first makes sense. The problem in practice is that you and I may agree on who those violators are. At the UN, regrettably, the view is quite different. Unfortunately, where I am in Geneva, when the United States is criticized, the whole room will clap. This is a concern. So it'd be difficult to get the UN to agree on who those first abusers would be. And I think Jennifer made a good point that if we need to strengthen the mechanism. That, for UN Watch, is one of the greatest concerns, is that we will have some sort of universal review, but as I said, it will be a questionnaire. As some other UN review mechanisms are, it will be toothless. And so if there's, as much as possible, I think democracies need to devote attention to making this a mechanism that counts, and if it's by having some democracies go first and set a precedent for a real rigorous review, that might be a good idea.
Mr. Chairman, that was actually my suggestion, and I really do think that that would be a good test to find out how determined the Council is going to be in pursuing this process. As we've seen in the United Nations many, many times, and not just on the human rights issues, but in other areas, the tendency is to try and dilute the process, water it down, become the lowest common denominator, and I expect this process to be subject to that same pressure. Why waste time trying to hold the Czech Republic up when there are already extensive reports out there, extensive evidence, extensive documentation on the practices of a number of human rights abusers out there? And I think that it should be up to countries that have exemplary records to suggest who should go first. And this will quickly decide and determine and illustrate how seriously the Council will take this issue.
I appreciate that. I would just note that one of the aspects of Manfred Nowak's report that struck me, in addition to his just description of what was actually happening and the types of torture individuals were experiencing, was that the noticeable fear that he detected with virtually or almost everyone he met. They didn't want to tell their story because of fear of reprisals. And it seems to me, for those who are in the Laogai today, whether it be Falun Gong or any other religious or political group, and are experiencing the ravages of torture, the sooner the cavalry arrives to say, wait a minute, this is totally uncivilized, unacceptable behavior, might have an ameliorating effect on what those torturers do. So I would tend to agree with Mr. Schaefer. I understand, and I think your points are very well taken, the other panelists. So I would also point out that one of the things that Wei Jingshang said here, I first met him in China when the Chinese government was seeking to get Olympics 2000. He was let out briefly, then rearrested before he was sent out of the country for humanitarian purposes. He was dying as a result of the beatings and mistreatment. But he said it is counterintuitive, but it was his experience in the Laogai, and he experienced incredible tortures, that when we were tough, we being the United States and the international community, and really spoke boldly truth to power in Beijing, the torturers eased up. It wasn't that they retaliated. It said, you know, you would think just the opposite, but he said it was such that when we broke bread with them and you know, exchanged pleasantries, the torturers became much more emboldened to do worse things. So I think all your points are well taken. I think, by and large, I would hope that China would lead the queue in terms of analysis. That's just my view. Let me ask you, with regards to the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, what would be the panelists' view on whether or not that needs to be done away with, and your view on it?
Well, I'd like to say something. I've just come from the latest subcommission session, and I've had the unfortunate experience of attending several subcommission sessions, and I don't recommend it to someone who cares about human rights. You know, last week and the past few weeks, we've seen Saddam Hussein on trial for the genocidal gassing of Kurds in Halabja. Well, if those who know subcommission history will know that in the 1980s, when someone tried to condemn Saddam for these crimes, around the time they were happening, two members, Halima Warzazi of Morocco and Alfonso Martinez of Cuba, and others, put forward a no-action motion to kill an attempt to stop Saddam. They shielded Saddam as he was gassing the Kurds of Halabja. Those two members sit on the subcommission today and have been there for decades. Those are the types of people. Not all. We have excellent American members and some others, but unfortunately these agents of repressive regimes dominate the subcommission, and it's been an agent for many misdeeds. Halima Warzazi 2 years ago began the session by comparing Israelis to Nazis. And this is sort of typical of what the subcommission does. The subcommission that I have seen, unfortunately, has failed its mandate to protect human rights and does not deserve to last any longer.
I have nothing to add to that.
Let me, in terms of definitions, if you could give your views on, do you believe, each one of you, if you could answer this, as to what the Human Rights Council construes to be human rights? Should it be treaties freely entered into and ratified by states, or should it be statements made at conferences, which very often were undemocratic, at least in my view, in many cases? How do we define human rights? Mr. Halperin, Dr. Halperin?
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, as you're aware, there is a treaty on economic and social rights as well as on political and civil rights. So those of us who think that political and civil rights deserve a special place in the pantheon, as OSI does, nevertheless can't win that argument by saying just focus on treaty rights, because we have the second treaty as well. But I do want to say there's another body of rights that I think are very important, and that, as I mentioned in my testimony, are the standards that have come out of the work of special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Commission and now hopefully the Council, and which have been in some cases endorsed by the General Assembly and in some cases endorsed by the Human Rights Commission. Those play an important role in the internal debates in countries about their obligations to deal with human rights problems. And while they are not treaties, they are developed through an expert process and I think play an important role. Similarly, I would say the Warsaw Declaration, which created the Community of Democracies and committed its members to join the Democracy Caucus, is a useful document. So while I agree the treaty should get the highest attention, it doesn't help us particularly with the conflict between political and civil rights, and we need to recognize that there are other kinds of resolutions that play a very important role in the struggles that people have in individual countries to get their rights, and we should not denigrate them in a way that makes it harder for them to use those documents.
Well, Freedom House is quite clear about what we think should be the focus in terms of fundamental freedoms. We focus on political rights and civil liberties, and we believe that that should be the Council's focus. In terms of other bodies, I think that the issue, again, is one of focus and dilution, and it's been a strategy that's been implemented in many bodies around the world to try to dilute, to add other important issues that are important for development, for humanitarian reasons, in a way to sort of step back from that. And I want to include another important right that I think is implicit in a lot of the treaties, and particularly in the human rights defender treaty, which is the rights of freedom of association and the right to assist those who are actively trying to implement that freedom of association in their own country. Again, I think it's very important that we move from beyond right to protect to right to assist those people that are actually struggling for human rights and for basic fundamental human rights, civil and political rights in their countries, and we need to assert that much more forcefully.
Mr. Chairman, I think it was mentioned before by Dr. Lagon that regrettably too often the reference to economic and social rights is used as a pretext to divert attention from failures to respect basic civil and political rights, and this is a trend that we see. One tends to see economic and social rights cited not by governments that wish to be held accountable themselves, but as a question of what is owing to the governments. And that's when we speak about human rights, whether it's civil or political rights, or even at the UN economic and social rights, the question always ought to be what is owing to the individual. Too often the governments invoke economic and social rights, not as whether they'll give food and water to their own people, but rather what others, whether it's the West or the international community, owe. And again, as a diversion to their own failures to respect basic democratic rights. It's something that we see and we ought to be mindful of and to combat.
A lot of this, what I was going to say has already been said, especially the issue about the diversionary tactic of using the economic, social, and cultural issues to try and divert away from, attention away from the political and civil issues. I certainly agree with the Chairman's opening statement wherein states sign treaties, they implement treaties, and they adopt treaties by the processes of their governments in the way that they've agreed to be done. And those nations should be held accountable for their own decisions to adopt those obligations. But the effort that seems to be going on in many cases is to try and elevate norms or standards that have not necessarily been agreed to and are developed in a very ill-defined and ambiguous fashion that evolves over time. And I think that it's very concerning that this process is going on and that the United States in particular, as the nation that I live in and the nation that I live under, as far as its laws are concerned, has to be aware of and to be concerned about.
Let me ask you a question. In my opening, I mentioned the issue of abortion, which is obviously very divisive. Mm-hmm. It's one that reasonable people can be found on both sides of the issue, at least I believe that. But it's also one that I think the respect for the unborn is an idea whose time is coming. It hasn't come yet, but like Victor Hugo said, nothing's more compelling as an idea whose time has come. And it's because of modern science, ultrasounds, diagnostic techniques, prenatal surgery, which is doing incredibly useful things on behalf of unborn children, that in the past, I chaired the Spina Bifida Caucus in the House, and prenatal surgery now is causing many of those kids who would have had less of a quality of life to have a tremendous life ahead of them because of the surgery done while they were still in utero. What got me personally into the human rights issues 30 years ago was the right to life issue, and all of the rest is built upon that. If you have a right to life, assembly and all the other religion naturally flow from that. My question is, what do you think the position should be of the Human Rights Council? I contend, and others can disagree, that many of the very important treaty bodies have misused their mandates to browbeat and cower countries who do listen to the UN, much more than the United States perhaps might, to look at their laws as they relate to respecting life and to reverse them. I believe that abortion is violence against children. Some of you may disagree. I don't know that. But I do believe that the very methods of abortion, chemical poisoning and dismemberment, are acts of violence. There's no way to call it benign or compassionate for the child when that is occurring. And I do believe we need to protect both mother and child and to provide protections of pregnancy care centers and the like. Having said that, the Human Rights Council, I think, could become very much more controversial and its work undermined if it were to embrace abortion as an additional mandate Right now, it's all this, and again, the Committee Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, I've read many of their reports, and I've also read their documents, their treaties, as well as the protocol. Nowhere does it even remotely suggest that abortion is a right, and yet, by usage on the part of some of the experts, they try to suggest that that's the case. I think this would hurt and undercut the Human Rights Council's work. I would be interested in knowing what you think. Who would like to go first? Dr. Halperin?
It's not something that I've thought about, so I think I should pass on that for now.
Okay.
I can just attest, since I actually attended the 1996 Cairo conference, that if they took on this issue, it would, in fact, stop action on all other issues.
Okay, I'll only conclude on that remark that I was at Cairo as well, and one of the provisions in Cairo was that it's up to the state legislature or the federal governments to decide that. And I would also just finally point out that Martin Luther King's niece, Alveda King, has had 2 abortions and now is a passionate defender of the unborn child. And she makes the point, she's a part of a group called Silent No More, that there are 2 victims in every abortion, both the mother and the baby, and that we need to recognize the longer, intermediate, longer term deleterious effects to women, particularly psychologically and emotionally. So but I appreciate your comments. Let me just conclude by asking any of you if there's any other recommendations that you might make. Your testimonies were outstanding for the Congress, because again, this is part of an ongoing review, and many members are concerned about this. Any final comments?
Yes, I'd just like to add, because this subject has come up in the testimonies before about the decision for the United States to run for a seat on the Council and the prospect of doing that in the future. The recent votes in the special session and in the recent session in June reveal that just simply having the United States on the Council is not going to affect the outcome of the various votes. The U.S. can't do it alone. The Council's future depends on the determination of the member states on the Council to act in concert to do the right thing, in essence. The U.S. decision not to run places the onus specifically on the other member states to do something. It is all too often in the United Nations system, what you have is the United States set up as the one party, and then everybody else set up as the other party. And even when states are like-minded and agree with the United States on an issue, all too often that support disappears or evaporates when the push comes to shove, the votes are taken. And in this process, it's too important for the other member states to really step forward and act to support the various positions in this council in order for it to be effective. And so we need to know, the United States needs to know, whether the other council members are willing to step up and take this burden and accept the responsibility for what's going on to make the council more effective than its predecessor. By running for a seat without knowing this, the U.S. unduly lends credibility to the council when in fact it may not deserve that credibility. The U.S. can participate in the process through either making statements, making pronouncements, or working through other like-minded states on the council. And this process right now, I think, is very malleable. We need to make sure that the council evolves in a way that is going to be productive. And by prematurely announcing that the U.S. is going to run for a seat, you're removing a lot of pressure for that outcome to be beneficial.
Mr. Chairman, in the report released today by UN Watch, there are several recommendations, and I'll just mention a few. One of them is to take action against human rights violators. As I mentioned in my testimony, not a single member state has declared its intention to introduce any resolution on any specific violation. The only standing commitment to do so, of course, is the political resolutions targeting Israel. So we encourage democracies to announce now that they will take specific action, whether it's against Burma or North Korea, in defense of human rights victims there, country-specific resolutions, and where appropriate, special sessions. That's number one. Number two, protect democratic values. I mentioned we have a democratic alliance of only 11 of 47 states that can be relied upon to stand up for democratic values and vote the right way, the way democracies ought to. We need to expand that group. We don't have a magic answer for that, but to begin with, these 11 democratic countries need to reach out to the South American countries who are not voting like democracies, and leading NGOs have a role to play to cite those countries that are voting with the Cubas and the Chinas and the Saudi Arabias. And we need to help them overcome political pressure to choose the side of democracy. Just two others. Many democratic countries have come to the defense of NGOs. We need to continue to do that. In the preliminary session in May or June, the Syrian representative said NGOs need to be, quote, strictly monitored. And we did not get a response from any democratic country in that plenary to say NGOs need to have their participation strengthened. So democratic countries need to continue and increase standing up for NGOs. Finally, regarding the one-sided obsession with Israel, I note that three leading NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Reporters Sans Frontières, last month took important stands against the actions that they said were highly politicized, one-sided, and exploit human rights for political ends. We salute those NGOs for taking those stands and encourage them. They're extremely influential to continue to tell the truth and to try to save the Council from the abuses. One part of this, which has not been mentioned yet today, is the regional group segregation. When the Council began, before there was any resolution or any statement whatsoever, Israel was the only country, as it was in the Commission, excluded from any of the 5 regional groups. The regional groups are vital for participation. This segregation has to end. Kofi Annan has called it an anomaly, but we haven't seen action in Geneva. And so we call on Secretary General Kofi Annan to ask the High Commissioner, Louise Arbour, to lead the effort in Geneva, publicly and privately, to end this denial of basic equality at the Council. And we note that the Western Group at the General Assembly in New York does include Israel since the year 2000, and logically, it should do so at the Council, which is, of course, a GA subsidiary body.
Thank you. Just first of all, I would say I really think that the Universal Periodic Review needs to publish its findings. Whatever kind of mechanism it comes up to actually publish what the findings are, I think will have a very, very important role to play. 2, utilization of procedures. I urge the Council utilize its procedures for removal of its members. I want to say that actually all 7 major human rights treaties have such procedures currently, and they have never, in fact, been utilized in a state-to-state mechanism. I also would mention that the U.S. government also has such a provision for citing countries as gross and systematic human rights abusers under Section 502B and 116, and it's never been utilized. So we need to follow up, I think, on those procedures. On the last issue related to my colleague's comments on engagement, we did a study of U.S. leadership at the United Nations along with the Council on Foreign Relations in 2002, and your colleague, Representative David Dreyer, co-chaired that council with then retired Representative Lee Hamilton. We had everybody from every side of the table on the United Nations, and what they all agreed on is that actually the United Nations is a political body, and perhaps the best analogy is this body in terms of the U.S. Congress. And what I would ask you is, if you wanted your fellow members to take action, would you just wait and see if they do the wrong thing, or would you try to persuade them?
I want to underscore that point, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my former boss, Secretary Albright, that the United States is the indispensable nation. It's fine to say we'll use this as a test of whether the European Union or the Latin American democracies will step up to the plate, but we do that at the expense of the people around the world struggling to protect their human rights and to expand their freedoms and democracy. And I don't think that that's an appropriate trade-off to make. The UN, the Human Rights Council, will be more effective if we're there, if we are embarrassing people by standing up when Syria says NGOs should be controlled. If nobody else will do it, we should do it. And if nobody will call a special session on Darfur, we should call it. And if nobody will lead the struggle to say that Chinese human rights violations should be condemned, we should lead that struggle. And we can't effectively lead it unless we're on the council. If the council fails, there'll be plenty of people to say that and plenty of opportunity for recriminations. But we should be the human rights leader of the world. We are the human rights leader of the world. And when we say we're stepping back to see whether it works, that unfortunately doesn't encourage others to take the lead. It encourages others to say, well, if the U.S. doesn't consider this an important venue, then why should we stick our neck out and get attacked? So I think that it was a mistake for us not to run the first time, that we ought to run now, and we ought to play a leadership role and not let the council get away with the kinds of things that it's gotten away with in the first session because we were not there. I would also say I would urge you to work with your colleagues to continue to supply support to the council. Threatening to cut off the funds or cutting off the funds would only backfire and make it impossible for the U.S. to exercise its leadership. And I think we always have to remember that what's involved here is the people struggling for human rights around the world, the Chinese, the Cubans, people in Darfur and others. And that's where I think our first allegiance ought to be in making these decisions.
I want to thank our extraordinary panel for your insights. These views will be widely disseminated, as you know, on Capitol Hill. I would note for the record, and would ask unanimous consent that, and without objection, that a letter that I wrote along with Congressman Hyde, Chairman Hyde, be included in the record at this point, because we did ask that we run when that opportunity presented itself earlier in this year, because I do believe you can engage better inside the room as opposed to outside. Even if we have serious problems with what's going on, I think we need to be in. So your point's well taken, although I certainly understand Mr. Schaefer's point as well. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future because we will hold follow-up hearings to this one. The hearing is adjourned.
Not at all. Oh, you were in Geneva. Oh, that's funny.
Yes, we were crossing the Atlantic at different
okay,
times, so
that's
I
funny.
apologize.
Not at all.
Are you here for a couple more days?
No, I'm heading to New York doing briefings there.
Okay, are you going to be back in Geneva during the council?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to be there the week of the 25th.
Oh, really?
So let's try and set
Let
something
me just
up.
give you my card.
Yeah.
Fortunate. I just met your ambassador in Washington, and I think he's a quick study. And
He's there.
I hope he'll do well. Yeah.
Yes.
And he's
How are you?
eager.
That was okay.
You have my numbers, call.
Yeah.
And
It's
sit them in.
really, I'll send you an email. Okay. Kind of backed up on the survey we're doing. If I'm, yeah. Okay. It's gonna,
If I'm not
How do you
here,
do?
talk to Barry, because I'm gone next week.
I didn't know that they were last minute adding you, or else I would have been late. I would have said you're a partner as well. I did not do that purposely.
I saw you would not mention me because you didn't know it.
Right?
I saw you
I
come in.
remember there was some discussion about you being added, and then I kept asking, is it happening? My first name ends.
I said, when that happened, that, I said, Freedom House can't be the most liberal member on a panel. That's really, I've never been on that.
So you have someone to your right.
So,
Well,
I
I think,
I have to urge you to,
nice to meet you. I love this thing the day before the
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much for holding the panel. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much.